Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So we have a great group of panelists, and we're going to be discussing how to navigate the grant application process, specifically working with multidisciplinary teams. And that's all you know. Working with multidisciplinary teams is something that is being highly more and more encouraged by universities and funding agencies. Let's start by introducing our panel. So I'll ask each of you to introduce yourself and maybe talk about a little bit about your work, what kind of project you work on, and whether you have an extension, research, or teaching appointment. Maybe later we can discuss also how to integrate research, extension, and teaching into the grant application process. So how about we start with Shadi?
Can you hear me well? Hi, everyone. My name is Shadi Atala. I am Associate Professor at the University of Illinois. My appointment is research and teaching, and most of my funded research has to do with either modeling pests and diseases, and so sustainable agriculture, broadly speaking, and another subset on payments for ecosystem services. So that's in terms of grantsmanship. Thank you.
When you notice he's saying on sound, should we figure out which microphone's working online? Because you said you couldn't hear us, right, Shadi?
No, I was asking if you could hear me.
Yeah, so can you hear us okay?
I can, yeah.
Okay, great, sorry.
Yeah, thanks for checking. No.
Oh, me? No.
Yeah.
I'm Dawn Thomany. I'm at Colorado State University, tenure added extension to the mix. And I started working in food systems before that was a term or a field to be in. So I'm one of the senior people who helped kind of make that a thing. And so that's why I mostly do work with, which basically means I can work on anything from natural resources and farm gate all the way up to consumers and food waste and food security. So by definition, if you're not going to be a specialist, you learn to be interdisciplinary as just the way to make your contribution. So I fell into it quite accidentally, not strategically. If I would have had something like this to go to 25 years ago, it would have been helpful. But hopefully we all can share things that we figured out muddling through it in different stages. But I'm the elder stateswoman on the panel. Most of these guys are much younger and did it right the first time. So listen to them mostly.
I don't know if much younger. We're about the same age.
I like to believe they're much younger. None of us are aging.
That's true. Touche. My name is Marco Palma. I'm a professor at Texas A&M. I actually went the opposite path that as Dawn. I started there with a 100% extension appointment. And that's where I used to collaborate a lot with industry, trying to identify problems, solutions, challenges, opportunities, but there are also strengths of different sectors. And I learned a lot about agriculture in those years. Since then, I've changed my appointment, mostly related to my current work. I'm a teaching and research split these days on paper, because I still do a lot of extension work. I love it. And there's no way to be connected and to get grants unless you're really there with the people that need the tools, that need the help. And so even though I have no formal extension appointment, I still do a lot of that work. And I guess like many of you, if you ask your significant others and your spouses, none of our appointments really add up to 100, right? It's always more than that. And so I think that's probably a common theme in terms of trying to make that merge or that transition point. I study human behavior. And so the stuff that I do, it's within the ag and food sector, but that also allows me to ask questions about general human behavior that might not be related to agriculture. And so I think these days, like Dawn said, I'm just trying to find something that excites me, something that is relatively new, that I'm going to be learning about, and that also serves the purpose of not having preconceived notions for the way things are, and try to ask the basic questions to the people who are there that have the knowledge to answer those questions. So I'm glad to be here to sharing this panel, not only with very colleagues that I admire a lot, but very good friends through the years. Yeah.
Thank you, Marco. Hi, my name is Miguel Gomez, and I am faculty at Cornell University. I have been there for 20 years. And, you know, I'm still evolving my research interest, but basically, in a nutshell, I do research on food systems, how food systems operate and work. And I try to, I try to understand what are the different economic, environmental, and social implications of different ways in which the food system is organized so that it works for consumers, for businesses, for the environment, and for workers. So that's what I do. I started Cornell, my appointment was 50% research, 50% extension. I love teaching. And finally, when I got tenure, I was able to teach one class. So I now have still my 40% extension, 40% teaching, and 20%, 40% research and teaching. And I'm also faculty director of the Food Industry Management Program. And that's a little different type of outreach. We do executive educations for the food industry, mostly focusing on supermarkets and CPG companies in the US, Japan, India, China, Latin America, and we have short programs, 1-week programs on leadership, on trends in retail, in food distribution and marketing. That's what I do. And I do focus mostly on specialty crops.
Hello, my name is Karina Gallardo. I am with Washington State University. My appointment is 70% extension and 30% research. And on top, nothing adds 100 in academia. I teach a class. I teach Intro to AgriCom class to students from different disciplines. My work is very broadly defined, similar to everybody in the table. I do my core extension program is to develop an enterprise a database of enterprise budgets. So we try to stay up to date on keeping enterprise budgets for different specialty crops in the state of Washington. And then my research part, which also fits my extension program because it's research-based extension, goes from things like consumer demand for new technologies, consumer demand for food quality. I do something of investment models. And right now I'm doing things like pest and disease modeling with Miguel and Shadi. We're trying to work with Marco as well on something innovative in consumer behavior of fruits. And then going into supply chain now. So it is very broadly defined. It is where the needs of stakeholders and also whatever is right now emerging as a very interesting topic is coming. So I believe all of us, we're not encased in just one single topic or theme.
I don't think it works. I don't know. I mean. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay, that's great. So all of you in this panel have been very successful obtaining funding from different agencies. So this is going to be an open conversation then, so we hope to get questions from the audience. I'm just going to get started with the questions, but please feel free to interject at any time or ask questions that you think may fit with what we're talking about. So can you talk about, I guess, key learning points what you've learned or key strategies for successfully applying for grants with multidisciplinary teams?
Well, let me start just to put some boundaries around this is sometimes I'm not even sure everyone means the same things by interdisciplinary. Because what you've already heard from the way we've been talking, sometimes it's truly interdisciplinary that you need scientists from across the university on it. Sometimes when people say interdisciplinary, they really kind of mean engaged scholarship and that it needs extension in it because another way to bring in knowledge or science is the practitioners on the ground who are doing it, informing the research question, and if you're on base. And so sometimes it truly means discipline, sometimes it means really inter-stakeholder. And I think increasingly, because we all kind of work in food systems, it could even be interdisciplinary in a way of like talking about how a policymaker would talk about it versus an industry person would talk about it versus academics. So part of this is just to say interdisciplinary can mean a lot of different things. And when you get asked to be an interdisciplinary project, maybe your first step is to get the boundaries on what that team who's inviting you means by that, because all of those are really important, but I would go about each one of those a very different way in setting up the project. So interdisciplinary, like I said, kind of is a really well-used term now, but it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I don't know if you'd agree. And then I would say the other thing I would say is we will focus a lot on grants today because that's officially in the title. But increasingly, again, as I get senior, I would say my funding portfolio certainly still leans into competitive grants. But there's also cooperative agreements, which the way the federal and state governments are going and the way they've been destaffed, increasingly we're being considered partners who it's not as competitive, which means it sounds like it thinks it'd be easier to manage those, but it also comes with a lot of strings and expectations and sometimes less publishability, not always. And then you have foundations out there funding things. And so we can certainly talk about grants, but I think also, particularly when you get into interdisciplinary, the chance of it being a competitive grant is high, but there are also so many different ways to fund a portfolio of research, particularly in the interdisciplinary area, that we might we might want to. I learned there isn't a roadmap. I have about 10 different roadmaps depending on which of each of those ways I answer those questions are. So I'll stop there because I've already talked enough, but in the future, as I answer questions and challenge my colleagues, let's talk about it in the fact that there isn't really a best practice. There's actually quite a few ways to navigate getting funding these days. And at least during my career, I feel like that's gotten more complex, not complex in a hard way, but complex in terms of the dimensions have really expanded, in my opinion. I don't know if you guys have seen the same thing.
Yeah, definitely.
And Karina, particularly, maybe you start with like what this means when you have a strong industry stakeholder presence, because in some states, particularly, especially crops, there were some mandates that actually got those appointments. I was lucky, I walked into a position that was pretty free form, kind of just find a way to be impactful, and especially crops particularly. I feel like sometimes those were so driven by the industry got us that money that sometimes they feel like they get to wag those positions, but I don't know if that's been your experience at all, but in our state, that's definitely the case.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There are we have a very strong industry. The tree fruit industry is very strong and very, I will not say influential, but we work together as WSU, as an academia institution, a lot with the industry. And yes, they fund many positions. They have these endowment chairs, but they did not fund economics. I don't receive directly money from them. So yes, I work with them, obtaining data, doing focus groups. For many studies, I gained some sort of collaboration relationship with the industry members, but not necessarily directly funding.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, no, it's fine.
One particular one I've
Yeah, no.
navigating it.
Yeah, no.
I think the very important issue that comes along with that is whether you have constrained resources. All of us have a limited amount of time. How do you invest in terms of applying to grants, doing research? Who do you want to collaborate with? And in some cases, people come to you and they say, the approach for multidisciplinary might be, well, we need someone from extension. Can you do something extension-y?
And they'll use that word.
And
extension.
or say, hey, we need some economic analysis. We don't know what it is exactly, but we need something in the proposal. And we have a $1.5 million proposal, and we're willing to give you $30,000. And so, to what degree is that something that is worth undertaking? And they might say something like, We need to start developing this relationship, and then maybe next time you'll be a little bit more involved. I know this is last minute. And I promised to myself, I'm going to say no to all of those things. And somehow I get in the game of trying to see if we can find a way to do something, particularly if I find the question to be interesting and relevant. But a lot of that has to do with when I started as a faculty member, it was a completely different landscaping environment. It's like ag economists, we had our own grants that we typically apply to. They were relatively small. And if you got one or two, you were good for your promotion package. Now we're going to this model in which you have teams of 20 people or more, very large, truly multidisciplinary. And by that, what I mean is people from different departments, different colleges, looking at one particular problem. Most of the funding that we apply to is within the USDA or some of the common things that we all know. But sometimes, occasionally, you would be working with a group that is applying to NIH, NSF, and those are completely different ways of writing grants. Even the way the grants are written, they're a little bit more written for a non-specialty, but science reviewer. Whereas the grants that we are usually involved are more important about whether it's solving a real problem that is going to benefit stakeholders and is going to benefit people. So the way you frame and motivate those grants is very different than the way you write a proposal. So the first month after arriving to Texas A&M, my department head told me, I think that you need to go to this panel, because in this panel, they're going to explain how to write grants. And these were the national program leaders for all the different programs in the CSRES, I think it was the name of the, or they used to be called, which is now NIFA. And so I went there and I realized this is very different than writing a paper. And in fact, I was using a lot of economic jargon that nobody in the panel will understand. And there's a human nature that if you don't understand something, you put it away, or you don't want to invest the time to really understand what they're saying. You move through. Now, compound this with the fact that you're going to be reviewing 20 or 30 grants, or sometimes even more. That just makes you an excuse to go quickly and pass the page quickly, right? You get a little bit more tired. So the second thing I did was to volunteer. And I think we probably were together in a couple of those panels where you were volunteering in the panel to be part of the reviewers. To me, that's when, I mean, it opened my eyes to the way things are supposed to be written. Because if you sometimes I think that are my biggest sin, and it's still a little bit like that, is to try to write things in an economic sense. And I think that in some of these proposals, it's more important to make sure the non-economists are able to understand what you're trying to communicate and the importance of what you're trying to find. So it's a challenge to know which groups am I going to be with. I've had in the past, I'm a storyteller, so I could tell you stories like that. But I've had grants in which I've been with groups that I thought they were not, that the question wasn't really interesting to start with. I thought that the chance of getting a grant would be very close to zero, and they've been funded for millions of dollars. And I've been in grants that I think the best grant I've ever written, it was funded, but then it wasn't funded. You remember that? Oh, yeah. And so anything can happen. So there is some stochasticity, some stochastic component to this. The reviewers are not necessarily, all the same level of expertise and everything else. And so, like everything else in life, I always think about problems in two dimensions. Here are the things that I can change, and here are the things that I cannot change. So if the reviewer didn't get it, there's nothing I can do about that. But there's something I can do about writing it better so that the reviewer does get it. And so what is it that is under my control that I can do to try to improve my chances, even if it's just a little bit, to get that funding? And then at the end of the day, you want to work with people that you like. So if you're going to be involved in a grant for 4 or 5 years in a project, you better like the PI, because you're going to be talking to that person quite a bit. And you better like the people you're going to be working around. And so building those relationships can really help you to navigate through those years in which you're producing output, but also you're creating sometimes long-lasting professional relationships with other people that become friends, co-authors, and beyond.
Should we give Shadi a chance?
I think that's
Shadi,
a
do
good
you want to go jump in?
Yeah, so for those who are at the beginning of their career, a lot of institutions offer what's called the Research Academy or some training to write grants. I found those very helpful, especially if you were to write a grant where you are the PI. So I think taking these trainings, usually they are spread out over a year. And so I found it very helpful to use that year-long training with weekly meetings on Fridays to structure my my writing of my grant. And so one useful thing to do is to really start really early and then use that structure over a year to write it. One thing they encourage us to do, which I found very helpful, was to contact the program officer also a year early with an abstract, and then get feedback on them. Before COVID, they would sometimes even fly you to DC to meet with the program officer. Now you could do it, I don't know, maybe over Zoom, but definitely getting in touch with program officers is very common in the engineering space. And I think I had a very good experience contacting the program officer for the AERC program. And then as you start, don't do to others what other sciences do to us, which is inviting people at the last minute. To invite people a year early and then meet with them individually. Very important to ask them what they would like the grant to add to their program as well. So, make sure that the grant that you want to lead also serves the research and extension program of your co-PIs. And then one thing that was really useful also was to finish early enough to send the draft to the people in the sponsored research office in your institution and to senior colleagues in your department, and then take their feedback into consideration. That's really helpful. And all of that is very different than when you are asked to be a co-PI on a very large grant. The strategy here is very different. In my case, the strategy was to always say yes, at least initially, because it's very hard to predict which is going to be successful, which is not going to be successful. And it's a great way to meet other people on campus. One thing that was helpful was to present research to other departments in the college. And that led to people inviting me to be on their grants. And other things, like Marco said, of course, volunteer to be on these panels, and also ask senior people to, if they cannot make it to these panels or to a grant, to recommend you. There are a couple instances where my advisor couldn't go to a panel and he sent me, and that was very useful. Or some other times where a colleague recommended my name because she couldn't be on a grant, and that was very useful as well. So letting people know that you're ready to fill in for them, at least initially when you are starting, I found these to be helpful strategies.
Yeah, I just want to add a few things, and I agree with everything that you say, and I will talk in particular about my experience developing grants with multidisciplinary groups, which I think is the most exciting research that I have been engaged with when there are multidisciplinary groups. And then I just want to I wrote down some tips that I use because I was notably unsuccessful writing grants in the first 5 years.
I'm still unsuccessful at this rate. I mean,
well, I have my statistic of 5 that I sent, I get 1. Okay, and 1 is the mental. So let me give you some of my stuff. I finally started to try to play minor role in grants with senior people. Senior people are always willing to share knowledge, and I actually will sit down with them. How you write, how is it that you write? And then I noticed that the approach is so totally different to writing papers, and we are trying to write papers. So these people basically cut and paste from the RFP, the request for proposal. They use the same language as clear, very clear problem, but no, we don't we don't need to be very creative. He said, we just need to give them to present our problem and use the language so that they know that what we are proposing meet what they want. Another thing that I found very useful is that they use visuals. You know, I have seen that, say, people working on very complex population dynamics for pest disease or whatever, they select a graph and put it there and develop a small narrative. And as a reviewer also is so useful because the visual part, what you get. And I have seen the most successful colleagues that I work with, they use visuals, again, avoiding economic jargon. And one thing that you need to do when you tell me if it is experience, when you want to do multidisciplinary work, you need to accept everybody wants an economist, but everybody thinks that an economist is an accountant that is going to do an Excel cost benefit or whatever. So you need to live with that and to work with groups over time to convince them that you can deliver that, but you can do much more. And I think that's my mentality when I play this. I tend to play small roles in big grants. Say if it is a $5 million, they give you 300, 400,000. That for us economists is a lot because we don't have equipment. We just have people. And then I always have in my mind, I want to deliver what they want. Say if it is an Excel interactive, you know, interactive tool that can be used by growers, by policymakers, etc. But then you have your kind of agenda for your audience of economists or for whoever more academic. It doesn't need to be economists, but there are many multidisciplinary journals that are very interesting. So that has been very fun. And that's the part that is kind of more fun of that. And once you develop relationship with scientists and engineers that you work with, and they understand that you are not an accountant, that you can do much more, then it becomes more interesting. And it goes the other way around. I don't know, and this was my experience with Shadi. When we started working on this, on problems of invasive species, and you understand the models that biologists and people understanding behavior of viruses, the models that they have are incredibly complex. So sometimes it's just as easy as put an economic framework on what the models that they have, and then you can do many innovative things that are publishable in top journals as well, in addition to do other things. So those are some of my comments on this.
A quick follow-up on that, Miguel. I think your work has paid off because, you know, 10 years later, people do contact us nowadays to say, can you build a bioeconomic model for this disease, as opposed to, can you build a spreadsheet? Which, and you know, it's always important to remind everybody that it's important to start with the cost-benefit analysis of the spreadsheet. Otherwise, you know, how do we get the parameterization of the model? But it's impressive how much people in our community have educated collaborators across disciplines on what we can do, so that we moved on from, you know, can you give us the cost and the benefits of this, to can you help us build a bioeconomic model that integrates all of these parts? So things have changed for the better, which is great.
I'm really glad to hear that, because I thought it was just me. You know, sometimes just creating those relationships, especially in extension, you're always approached by a lot of individuals, and what they want is a budget. And it's usually last minute, so I like the idea of at the beginning, you know, accepting those, you know, offers and just try to create those relationships to be able to build a group to work with, and then eventually, you know, as they learn about the value they can bring to your to their teams, you know, you can actually ask for more funding, or hopefully they'll include you earlier in the planning process.
Let me say a disclaimer with that though. Because if you do the work for 30,000, subsidizing it with something else, they're gonna come back to you the next time thinking that you're gonna do the same for the 30,000, even though you were subsidizing with an assistantship from the department or whatever other sources that maybe you had a student or a postdoc that was not working necessarily on that, only on one project. And so the caveat here is if you take those You have to be able to say, well, we can't really accomplish these 5 objectives, but we can do maybe a subset of these. What is the most important thing that you really need to be delivering this? And so that you don't want to over subsidize, because people get used to that. And if they take advantage of you once, they're going to expect the same the next time as well.
I'm gonna ask a question to that. So how do you navigate those sometimes, especially for junior faculty? How do you navigate those conversations where it's funding, right? Because it has happened to me where sometimes they don't even tell you what your budget is, you know, like they just can do the total budget. How do you navigate this conversation? Or even the trade-off between what their objectives are and your objectives. And so how do you navigate those conversations?
So particularly if you're junior, because it is political, find an advocate. And so in our department now, we assign young faculty a mentoring committee, make us the bad guys. So if you do have to say no, just come and say, I took this to my mentoring committee for the budget you're offering and the scope of work that's here. They're advising me not to make us the bad guys. They can't do as much against us because we're awful. So that's one way to do it. Or put us at the negotiating table with you and have us go and say, like, we've worked together before, because usually we have, and we'll say, you know, then you can go to the strategy Marco said, where we help it get scaled back to either being a pilot or a seed or a scope that's more appropriate. And that's why the other thing I almost always tell people is get a reputation out there, whether it's you as an individual or using your department or department as an advocate, that like our protocols in our department are, if we're going to be on a grant, and you need to be 6 weeks out, because 2 weeks programs office wants the finalized budget. That's a firm deadline. And so if you get those protocols even out there, and sometimes that you can even be your department head or agency head that communicates those, then it never puts you in the crossfire of someone thinking you're being the problematic hard person to work with. It puts some boundaries around how people approach you, and just makes better social norms for everyone in your team then, right? So, because that's the thing I would also say, which we haven't mentioned, particularly on these big projects with multidisciplinary, start with the budget. You think you want to jump in and write the 18-page narrative. If everyone scopes out their ideas and gets all excited about them and writes them up, and then you get to the budget and no one's getting the amount they want, then someone feels like they either wasted their time or money or energy writing that part. So if you start with the budget on what the budget can afford to cover, and then assign, okay, so I'm making you scale back 10%, you 25, you 25%. Then before they even wrote up that part of their scope of work, they know where they're starting and what the boundaries are. That's the other thing we've really started to do, is we really start with the budget. And it also makes our sponsored programs office happier, because you can keep working on your narrative up through 24 hours of when it goes in. Usually in most of our big institutions now, when they have to have 4 colleges sign off and stuff, they want 2 weeks to actually to get it. So that's the other way to protect yourself. Say, like, we just can't because my college says, and now we'll protect you a lot. And I guess the last thing I would say, and this is a little less to protecting yourself, but for getting a good reputation and a good reputation, whether it's with industry people or students or whatever, lots of egos get in the room when it comes to budget time, and everybody wants salary and so on and so forth. The places we tend to underinvest, and panels recognize this now, particularly if we talk about those integrated projects with extension, is do not be shy about giving the producers you're going to ask time for money, students you're going to ask time for. So increasingly they want educational outcomes and components in these grants. Put stipends in there for everybody. Those guys are so much less expensive than us, so you can get a lot more leverage out of them too. But there's actually people who look for those kind of things as an indication in the budget of how authentically you're actually going to engage your industry partners, your students, whoever you're saying you're going to have an outcome to benefit. If there's any outreach to it, reward the people who are going to help you do that outreach effectively or gain the knowledge you need from the field effectively. So I kind of rotate all around and kind of what I think are budget points. But in my opinion, some of the biggest challenges with multidisciplinary have started or ended with the budget. And then the last trick and I was taught this on my very first, even though you bring it all into your university or set of universities, like me and Miguel actually have one right now. If you have many colleges and departments, this is a trick I learned. You can have then the university break it into subcodes. So if you aren't the PI and you want to make sure you have a protected set of resources, you don't have to ask permission for to use and so forth, they can make subcodes that are completely dedicated to you, that reflect whatever the budget justification went in for you. So you're not always in that kind of vulnerable position of going and asking permission from the PI for money. You have that sub account there that represents what you are committed to. And that gives you a little more comfort and feeling like you have an autonomous place. You can operate your part of the project.
Can I follow up on the
Of course.
budget? Yeah, so whenever, my experience has been like, whenever you get invited to these big grants, the first thing is you want to participate in this grant, and the second thing is give me a budget. So sometimes you don't even have an idea what is the other people doing, what is going to be the actual activities that other people are doing, and they just want the budget. So to put the budget, I think you have to put be very careful, because it will depend on what you are planning to do and what you think your contribution will be. So you might want to have an idea what type of data you're going to be using, what type of model you're going to be doing. Because if, for example, in my work, if you're going to do a survey, you need to have idea how much that survey is going to cost you. Sometimes surveys are expensive, $20,000. So that needs to be in the budget. How much, if you are going to work with a student, if you're going to work with undergrad students, if you want summer help. Also important is to have an idea of the travel you're going to be doing. Sometimes the project requires that everybody in the team travels to a central location once a year. So you have to put money for travel for projects, money for travel for data collection, and money for travel for outreach for these type of meetings. And be better if you do that, and also for the students, so the student also has the experience. And then money for publications, that's something important, at least $2,000 in publications. And then also I've seen more and more people asking money for rewards or tokens of appreciation for growers' time if you're going to do focus groups. And also people also put software. So sometimes software is given, but sometimes it's not, and you want to have, you know, a nice piece of Logic in your computer. So that is also costly. That's on the budget.
And the $15 beers at the conference, you want to go for that?
Yeah.
But yeah, I said it too simplistically. Grady's right. You do start with a budget, but you have a good team meeting before that. It's a very chicken egg thing though, because you get too much details laid out there for the scope of work before you do the budget. Almost always they get overscoped, almost always. And you have a budget limit you can ask for. So it's very chicken egg, but it's just, I should have more said, don't let the whole scope get figured out before you've at least had an initial budget discussion. So thanks for clarifying that. That was great.
I also always over budget a little bit because I know they will ask me to go down. So you start high.
That's a good tip.
And then you really know, because then you are a good citizen, you are willing to lower. I mean, you won't over budget too much, but I usually tend to ask for
It's
a
like
lot.
your wish list.
Yes, exactly. And then you start from there.
My perfect world.
No. With you, it was different because you are an economist.
I mean, another strategy that started using recently, particularly with young faculty members, is they get into a new relationship with somebody. They want to do something human behavior related. And so they come to me and I say, well, we can't do this for this amount of money. So what I will do is say, hey, why don't we send them a budget of what we need for the project to do? And then we're going to say that the lab is going to subsidize the rest of it. But that way they actually see the full amount of what's required. And then we tell them, look, we're going to do it this time to develop a relationship. And so that you know that we believe in this project, that we're invested in the project, and that we're using funding from our own resources to make sure that this happens. So we're in this together. And so it gives them the sense that you're a team, that you also have some skin in the game. And then you have somebody who's a little bit older doing these talks in the sense that, hey, you remove yourself, you're younger, you remove yourself from those conversations. And it's okay for most of us, I think, to say, hey, if that doesn't work out, then it doesn't work out. But that also gives them an idea of what you expect in the second time, when the second time comes for a new grant or something. They get an idea of the true cost of what it would be. Otherwise, my recommendation would be, I've turned down projects and say, hey, no, we can't really do this. But maybe you might want to make it work with somebody who maybe is looking for a new project, or somebody who the opportunity cost of grants and time and everything else might be lower, or things like that. And so there are ways in which you can try to leverage those relationships.
Questions? Oh, actually, more just a quick comment to what Don mentioned, integrated projects. You have integrated project extension. Remember also that participant costs are almost always indirect free. And so it's a way of moving on money in your budget.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You're
They're
not.
not in A&M.
We have to include it.
They're not part of modified grant cost.
Really, in A&M they are.
I don't know if our institution has caught that either. It's a good thing to bring back to my institution, though.
What is not included in ours is tuition. It's outside of the.
That one isn't, yeah, we
Yeah.
don't, our tuition definitely, we don't count. That's good to know. That's a weird part of us, right? You'll get to know some magical spreadsheet if you haven't gotten to know it yet.
Yeah.
That's a template that your budget office gives to you, which kind of automates some things because they figured out some rules. Watch it though, because there are sometimes mistakes in this handle, but that everyone has to have one.
Or at least for Acri FAS. No, Acri FAS, I don't.
Well, I didn't know that. But also just participant grant project is also a public relations project. And so people really feel like you invested in them. And what this whole even urban rural divide, at least in our state, is people thinking we think we have all the answers. So it's even a really strong signal to producers or food industry people or whoever you're working with, that we understand their knowledge is worth time and money as well. And that, at least in my state right now, is a really important signal we've been trying to send. So they're not taking for, they don't feel taken for granted that they think all the answers are these people making policies or educating in the urban corridor. So that might be too personal to my state, but it's gotten us a lot of public relations distance as well. But it's also just the right thing to do. But we keep forgetting what.
I don't, Shadi, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, do you have any comments regarding some of those budget conversations and strategies for putting together a budget when you're working with multidisciplinary teams?
The only thing I would add is that you can also ask for computer equipment if your university does not give your grad students computers and you know that they're going to be doing a lot of simulations. I've been able to add computer and we already mentioned software, but definitely hardware, you can also add that.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna change gears a little bit. I wanted to talk about, like, maybe you can give some advice for, especially for junior faculty. So there are some sometimes like smaller grants that you could apply for, and then you have the larger APRI grants, for instance. So being an FPI, and sometimes I've heard people advising younger faculty to junior faculty to go for smaller grants initially and then go for larger grants. But sometimes I think there's that pressure of starting applying for those larger grants initially. And I think that becomes especially harder, you know, managing a multidisciplinary team, especially as a PI. So I wonder what your take is regarding, you know, initially in your career, what type of grants to apply for, whether to pursue being a PI in a multidisciplinary team, and how to manage those expectations.
So I'll start, and I'll be vulnerable. I did not get funded my first 5 grants I wrote either, and I did not have a grant going into tenure. And I actually I found this because we had to move offices, and I saw a thing where, like, my big goal is I just want to get 1 grant before I retire. That was like literally somewhere in my paperwork. Things you wish for, like, but What I would say, and because one of my partners is in the room, I did start for those big CSRES grants, which are called NRI then, and wasn't successful. So I scaled back. And in our regions, we have risk management education centers, we have rural development centers, we have SARE projects. And so those are like solid high digit five digit grants. Sometimes they're getting to 6 digits now. So I went back there and I started there instead, where I actually both learned how to get a grant. Managing a grant is actually probably harder than getting the grant, just so you know. We're all talking about how to get the money. Managing projects is not trivial. At least managing them successfully. I guess if you crash and burn, it's pretty easy. But so sometimes I recommend to people in a portfolio, like if you want to try one as PI, where you get to like set the course and navigate it. There's so many of these centers now that give those out, and sometimes even internally at universities as seed grants. And so perhaps start with one of those, and they tend to have they direct you to be kind of more narrowly scoped. Sometimes they have you work with producers, sometimes they have you work with grad students, and start there. But then still be open to invitations where you're a minor player in these big grants. But it depending on what your personality is and where you need control and how anxious you get. For some people, like starting with those, and like, so that's then where I got finally my first successes. And in about a third of the cases, those smaller 5-digit grants were a seed project that I could then grow into. Like Western Risk Management Center gave me my first agritourism grant, like 58,000. But then I got to seed some stuff. So then when I went to NIFA to get the 500,000, I even had some initial results to share with them that were only for our state, because we wanted to blow it up and do the whole region. So also look for opportunities like that, where because of how you handle things and so forth, you might want to start with those smaller projects and get your feet under you and feel stable and feel like you've successfully executed a project before you get into the quagmire. Because once you get in some of these big teams, it is somewhat overwhelming, and you won't be able to maintain all control because you're only one piece of a puzzle that may have 18 pieces to it. So, and then if that one doesn't go well, and that's the only thing you have in your track record for a grant, that, that could be a little bit risky. So you know yourself to know where and that you belong. Again, thanks Joanne for being, their center was one of the first people who believed in me long time ago. So that and she's been a partner for my whole life now and professionally. So that's been great. So I don't know if anyone else feels that way about it, but I know sometimes departments want you to do the big ones, but your sanity is more important than the department's preferences.
Tyler?
I guess I would say that, but the management of a small grant is just as costly as the management of a large grant.
Not if there's only two, not if there's only two of you and you already know how to work together. Because human resources, at least for me, can sometimes be a challenge.
Right. Well, I mean, that was gonna be my next question.
Except for you, the grants with you go swimmingly.
I'm at a point where I've reached the limit of my human capital to manage more projects. How in the world do you continue to scale this up?
You hire program managers to help you
Okay,
with the
but
time.
That's $90K a year.
Yeah.
For a project manager.
And then
Project manager under a project management certification manages 2 projects. I've got 11. I'm gonna have 5 of them in $90K now.
so
Where do you get that?
it's economics. I mean, you can only get an additional project if you get the resources because you have constraints in your time. And so there's no way you can do it unless you add these other dimensions. So that means that the cost per project increases for every additional project you have. And that's a constraint we have to have. And so we've gone through that, Luis and I. In many cases, we just tell people, look, we can't really do it because I don't have more hours in the day and I don't have the people to do it. And I'm not gonna be out there doing the experiments because I don't have the time. So the only way we can do this is to hire additional people. But look, we refer you to other colleagues that might be interested and don't have all of these constraints.
But yours is a mid-career challenge, and not that that's not real, but for early career, let's not scare them yet. So
and that's a great problem to have, by the way.
and what I would say is, and you guys don't have to think about this all, but this is the other challenge with our profession. Our universities take that full indirect of 45 to 55, I think is the range. 50 across the street. And so, and we never ask for it. We don't have lab setups and blah, blah, blah. So we at ZSU, me and Becca Jablonski, have just finally gotten some centers put into place where we could go back and track all the indirect we know we have brought in for them, which we have tapped very little of. And so we got centers established because we have enough of a track record. Again, this is a mid-career problem, but we'll make you optimistic about it, where then they went ahead and gave us some staff because the university is going to be smart enough at that point to know there's an ROI on this. And if we give you this center, we could go back and prove to them. So remember to track these kind of things. You can track how much indirect you bring into your university that does not come back to you. And when you get to a mid-career point like Tyler, where this is the problem, we leveraged that and we went back and said, if you want us to keep bringing in this level of funding, we need something to help.
Yeah.
And because otherwise we're going to start saying no. It does not, this university doesn't win if we say no, but that is a mid-career problem. You, for now, just worry about getting your first grant and doing it really well. But Tyler, it is a really good point. And project management is real. That's the other thing you should start thinking about writing in. If you have any more than, my threshold is 6 team members or more than 2 colleges or 3 departments, you should have at least a part-time project manager where all they do is the tracking and the logistical stuff that have nothing to do with the true research outcomes, because there's more paperwork to managing that, particularly if you have these stipends and stuff going out. So it is totally appropriate. And some funders expect to see now a project manager in the middle of that once it has some level of complexity where that's warranted. Are the rest of you ever putting project managers in? I think you are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jing on R1 with ERS, for instance.
So I want to make a comment to connect something that Miguel said with Dawn's in terms of how do you choose whether to be the PI. I will advise you against being the PI in one of those big grants, at least for the first 3 years, because that's all you're going to do. You know, not going to do anything else. If you think about this as times being a very small place to write a page and a half out of the 18 pages to do something that is very general, which gives you 2 things. It gives you the flexibility to dream about what I'm going to do that is of interest to come present at this meeting. But at the same time, you're going to accomplish what the big team wants you to do. So that might be an interesting low cost way to get into those. But then you got to look at the percentage of projects that are funded. And so you got to look at the expected value of your time versus the likelihood of being funded. So my advice would be to manage a portfolio where you have a few. Industry grants, $100,000 grants are good when you're starting because it gets you going. It gets you to get one student. And once you get the student, you're working on a project, you're working on research. So what you really want to do at this point is you want to advance your research agenda. And people like to work with people that have money. So, you know, we just heard Tyler has issues managing problem. If you have an issue, if you have a problem interesting, bring it to people who have been successful. Talk to them. Hey, how do you write the grants? What's your average hit rate? For me, it is 10%. You were saying yours is about 20%. Is one of every 10 grants that I'm involved with, it gets funded. So it's frustrating. I understand that. But it's also a numbers game. Like you start to get better over time, hopefully, because you start to learn some things in this dynamic game. But talk to those people who are getting grants. So when you see them placing, getting grants, talk to them about what was the research question you had in mind? How does working with people in horticulture or other departments of your college help you get the grant? How do you make those connections? And so I think that just don't be shy in trying to ask those who have been successful.
Bonus points for early career faculty.
Sure.
So junior faculty,
It increases the likelihood for sure. So at A&M, they implemented this interesting grant program. It was called the T3. It was random assignment of funding. That's beautiful, isn't it? It's a very beautiful experiment.
Wow.
So people could just write their names essentially. I mean, you get to write a page, but it was like just to be binding to say you were going to do something with the money. And then 3 people. This is the constraint was it has to be from 2 different colleges. 3 people, and then they gave you $30,000. It was like to 100 groups. if you were early career, an assistant professor, your likelihood of getting funded was doubled. And so obviously you had an incentive in that, and NIH, NSF have all of these initiatives that they encourage participation of younger. So look at those and take advantage of them whenever you can.
It also depends on your position and the expectations your department head and the people who are going to be evaluating for tenure has. And I believe that needs to be clear. I don't know other universities, for example, at WSU, it is your entire department who evaluates your package, right? And then it goes to the college level, and there is a group of people from other departments who evaluate the package of the economist. That's where the trick part is, because other departments expect that economists be leading grants as well. So, and they sometimes don't get the message that, okay, my position was made for this type of work, maybe not to be the lead PI. So I will agree that keeping a portfolio is important. I built my career just being part of multidisciplinary grants. I have, like, out of all the projects I have probably 2 that I am lead PI, and they are very small. And I made it. So it depends on the understanding the people who are going to be evaluating your package have of your position. And be good that you say, well, for an economist, it is not easy to publish 6 or 7 or 8 papers a year, right? Like other disciplines are. Or for an economist, it's not easy to get like a USDA grant, because usually they want these multidiscipline teams and things like that. So I think it should start like, what are the bonus points if I am lead PI or if I am not? Have an understanding with the people who are going to be reviewing your package. I think it's important.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to something that because we were talking about successful rates and those being very low from competitive grants. And at the beginning, you mentioned cooperative agreements. And at least initially, when I started, I had no idea what cooperative agreements are, where and how do you even go about pursuing some of those opportunities. I was wondering if you could talk about what they are and how you pursue them.
Yeah, and these guys might have similar situations too, but as we all know, federal governments, and depending on your state governments have their staffs significantly decimated in different eras and times. So or they're a unit that doesn't really need a full-time economist, but occasionally have things come up where, like, for instance, our wine industry development board has to justify its checkoff program every 5 years to the joint budget council at our state. So as you start developing those industry relationships and stuff, and you get to know people, they'll bring cooperative agreements. A cooperative agreement is basically, instead of a competitive grant, they scope very, very, very vaguely what they want you to do, and you bring back to them a proposed scope of work and budget. Sometimes they'll actually give you a budget, they'll say, what can you do for 50? What can you do for 100? And so those, instead of being competitive, end up being conversations. You go back and forth and iterate that scope of work and budget until you both agree it's a good value proposition for you both. I think all but twice in maybe 50 I've had, we came to an agreement. So those are something you should be open to. Just so you know, and they've been here in spades. Some of you might actually be at Economic Research Service. I don't know everybody here. They right now are giving out very generously cooperative agreements. Now they're going to be more comfortable giving those to mid and senior career level people, but perhaps in your department or wherever you're working, of someone who actually has that relationship. So I'm now a known entity, so they tap me on the shoulder all the time. But I was 10 years in before they first tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you want to do something? I didn't even know those existed. And some schools seemed tapped into that pipeline, others don't. If you're a school that's not, and you want to be introduced, use your network to actually say, well, I hear your school has a lot of those agreements. Start mentioning us. Me and Miguel are on one where they brought money to us in Cornell, CSU and Cornell. I already knew I had a full plate, but I didn't want to say no to them because it was a big bucket of money. So I said, how about we do it? And I act as an advisory role, but we put out a seed grant program and we put it back out there. So there's lots of new models happening out there for even us to work with our government partners, because I knew I could never work for government. I don't follow rules well, but I love working with the government, and they're short. And even ERS, who is restaffed up so beautifully. They hired a lot of people without ag and food context who they now want to work as collaborators with us to get them there. So there are those opportunities as well. And they have different strings attached and so forth. They may not be quite as heralded and revered as competitive grants as being a true win, but they're resources. And if this is about a resource thing, and again, I also have those same things with my state, that's become almost a bigger set of my portfolio now than competitive grants because and it's that's where you want that trust building relationships, because the reason they're coming back is because you don't leave them empty handed. You do what they ask, even if it's you don't first and foremost worry about publishability. If you can find a way to publish it, do that, but you follow what they want first and do what they want first. And they're a little less risky. So I'm now up to like, I think 1 and 2 things I write gets funded. So that's always nice too on a ratio. When I started 0%, it was only going to go up. So that's another part of it. And then, but I would also say government's pretty trustworthy, particularly those agencies we've heard of. But no, there's way more than economic researchers now. There's rural development, ag marketing service, NRCS, EPA, all of those agencies really need more social scientists than they have. And so look for opportunities to plug into those as well. And then the third thing I would say is industry is going to come to you. That's where you should be the most weary, way less developed understanding of expectations and scope. So almost every industry or nonprofit partner I've worked with, I have done purposefully a phased situation, very small scope of work, very small budget, because you have to figure out how high maintenance they are or how high touch they need you to be. And that gives you an out if that doesn't go well without losing face. But what I almost always do is give them a 2-phase budget. I give them a very, very small scope of work. It's like, let's just get to know each other, work out and do something small. But they already seen the second phase. And if they're happy with how it went, you're happy. You don't go through the whole transaction cost of putting another proposal. You say, look, I'll share with you of doing this yet. And you might not have realistic expectations, scope it very small and tight, and build the relationship before you commit to too much. Because most of these traditional funders, there's an expectation that's pretty well known and protocols. With some of these people who come to you, particularly nonprofits are like this, they want the world and they want to pay you $10,000 for it. And you just need to have an exit clause so that you don't get trapped in that, particularly when they want you to say local foods will save the world and you're not willing to say that. And then they get really mad at you and they're like, well, let's just quit working together. But I shouldn't be silly about it, but that's the other thing I'm saying. So that's my portfolio now funding. Did I miss any other ways we're funded? You've worked with a lot of industry, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of development.
Yeah.
There are people who have been fascinatingly good at being development and building a big bucket of money off of a donor who got so enamored with their work, but that is not my portfolio.
Not yet. I'm trying, but unsuccessfully yet. 0%. We'll get there.
Has anyone in the audience been lucky enough to be the sugar scientist of some big foundation?
It depends on the discipline, right? For example, entomologists, I know they get a lot of donors. And I work with entomologists.
Yeah, economics too. I mean,
Economics.
yeah. We have names of economic departments, buildings. We name labs, classrooms. We will name everything depending on how much they give. We will name bricks if you just give a few hundred. So
So apparently you need a different panel if you want to learn how to do development money. That's not my gig.
I think the one thing I want to mention, and I agree, I mean, those cooperative agreements can be, I mean, they're lower risk, usually a couple of pages. They don't want more than that. So it's more probably mid-career. They know you've got the grants, they know you've got the track record to do things and execute them. And that's when they start coming for you to do this type of work. The other one I want to mention is the industry, because sometimes they come to you when Don talks about low amounts, it might be $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. And by the time you do the 50% IDC, you're like, I almost have nothing. So check with the universities. This is not something that happens all the time, but most universities will waive IDCs if the entity has in their laws, in their website, something that is not an email communication, but it's somewhere that they can go see that these individuals either have a limit on the IDCs or they do not pay IDCs. So if the limit is 10%, they will honor some of that. And so there is a way in which you can get a little bit more money. So if you put, you get 30,000, but it's really completely coming to you, it's gonna get you a little farther away.
And at my university, I don't know about Karina's, those were small grants, but they got fully counted as extension too. So they double counted because they not only look like a grant I brought in, but industry group was super excited and wrote a letter saying like, you don't tenure this person, will be really mad at you. That's pretty powerful. So sometimes it's worth, that's the only reason some of those small buckets are worth it, is you also get an ally in a trade association that every time they see your president or your dean talks highly of you, that actually is worth a lot of money, it turns out, because it makes you pretty fireproof.
So that's one comment that I have, is that whenever you put a letter from a stakeholder, that's why I encourage people, even if you don't have an extension appointment, that you do some sort of outreach, because when you have these relationships and you are working in any idea, a letter from a industry group or an association or a private company or an entity supporting what you do gives a lot of credibility to what you are proposing to do. And I would say, just I going to the question, in my case, I work small. I apply to all the seed grants and small grants that you have in the university. So you kind of learn, if you are managing a budget of $10,000, say, you get the experience of working with a student or with some reporting. And then you start building up kind of your portfolio of, in your CV, you put these things. It really helps to go small. The other thing that I want to mention is that all the programs have planning grants or small grants for workshops or things that are not $1 million, but give you some funding to start the idea. Then I think what I always have the vision of grants as, I look at them as papers. You submit them, rejected, and then you prepare for next year. Then you submit it, rejected, the comments change, send it next year. There are things that happen after 4 or 5 years. So it's kind of a long-term process. You expect to don't. I expected, but I felt always very frustrated. But when you know that you are very likely to fail the first time you submit the next year to the program, and little by little you get more possibilities.
So I think quite mention what you're saying, and I'll try to actually address the comments, because I've been in panels, and people think people don't forget about your grants, but sometimes they are like they serve, like I think I was in a panel for like 3 years, and people remember, oh yeah, we reviewed that last year, you can address this, they just send the same thing. So if you apply for something and get those comments, make sure you address them somehow, because you remember, and people in the panels remember those comments. So.
The program manager, he knows a lot about you. The program manager is key. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know we're talking about grants, but I've also received papers that I've reviewed in multiple journals with no changes, and that's frustrating too. When you have to read it, it's like, hey, it's the same paper. I've already reviewed these. I'll forward you the previous review.
Yes. So, do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
So when you're setting up your budget, once you have a senior faculty member or junior faculty members, how do you set up like your salary on that? Do you equal out days, or is that a thought at all? Or
That's a good question. So it depends on the programs. I think that we've gone mostly trying to equalize the amounts, so that it ends up being that it might be 2 weeks of your time, and then you use a month of the junior or something around those lines, so that you can more or less make it a little bit more equitable. But it's also important to look at who's going to be leading the work and the activities. And so you want to make sure that you consider those big picture. If you're going to be doing most of the work, you should get most of the proportion of the salary also.
Yeah, we've gotten to the point where we almost will do a Gantt chart. If you don't know what that is, it's just a matrix. And that's why this back and forth of the scope of work of like, you know, let's say you have 3 objectives and each of the objectives has 2 to 4 bullets. We'll literally have people put their names alongside that on the scope of work. And then, you know, not that every objective might need the same amount, but like it starts being much easier. Like literally the old days, just like put everyone out for a month and there was no rhyme or reason why people were and stuff. And actually the funders like that too. And when I'm reviewing a grant, I'm like, I don't have to worry about, that's almost really a management plan to me, because that's saying there is a person this buck stops with and that is written here. And then if that set of people and like how often you know, Samantha shows up doesn't equate to what I see in the budget of Samantha getting, I get very nervous. So this has gotten to the point, it's beyond fairness of your grant. A good review panel will actually do the tracking to say, this is actually de facto a management plan. And if they've really worked out the details of where the buck stops, who's in charge, who's going to be leading. And so that's why I meant about like, start with a budget. Once you have your major objectives, you should be able to assign that to a person and it should have some relationship. And there's also the operating costs like surveys and stuff, but I meant for personnel, that's what I have found been the most foolproof. And like, we've even gotten to the point on one grant we have, because the Economic Development Administration asked for really detailed reporting. Every 2 weeks, they get a email where they go to a website and they actually track by objective, hours they've spent, if they had an outcome, if they had a meeting. And so then when that quarterly report is due or annual report, whatever it is, it still has to be polished, but there's a list of things that were actually done by person, by objective. And in this case, it's the regions of the state of Colorado. And that was just something we added this year. And it's been really helpful when reporting comes around, because otherwise it's someone scrambling that weekend to put something together. So there's, and I was actually going to say this, hour and a half, you can cover a lot, but we talk about this a lot at AAEA in terms of where we are with mentoring programs. An RFA is not out, you to apply for, and what approximately was last year. When you brought a grant partly written and you actually, we had like a 1.5-day program where you actually worked on moving through some of the pieces of like,
It's a great
of
idea.
would people come to that? Because that, we're giving you lots of great advice, but it's like your head's probably ready to explode. But like, if you came with something partly in development, but people actually see that it's something where like, you actually literally could specifically say, how would you handle this? Is that something people would go to? If you're in the room, I assumed you were the most likely target audience.
I will do it too.
We actually at AAEA, the CAM program, actually we organized.
You just used a whole bunch of acronyms.
At the
nobody knows.
Northeast Agricultural Resource
Perfect.
Economics Association meetings, the career advancement and mentorship program.
Already did.
Yeah.
We had a panel almost exactly like
Oh,
this.
okay.
And so just to add that there were a bunch of our junior colleagues in that panel that are not here that I think would express interest in.
Okay, I'll take that back.
That would be-
I'd say one other thing on the salary, watch out, because I've got 12-month faculty and I've got 9-month faculty. And also understanding the incentives that sit behind that.
Yeah.
12-month faculty, they get money back in their pocket at the end, depending upon how that money is budgeted.
So I have a question for Tyler, and I think that the rest of the panels too, since you're operating at capacity, almost a capacitor, right? And as young faculty members are trying to merge what they do in research and to do grants to fund the research, what is your strategy when selecting the topics that you're going to get involved in grants? Do you become really good at doing one topic and you replicate that with different groups, different grants, different commodities, different groups? Or are you trying to reinvent the wheel every single time? It takes a lot more time. So I just want to hear about the trade-off and the balance of you guys in terms of, is it pretty much developing and narrowing down something that you know works that the funders really like and then replicating that same thing? We kind of did that several times, but then we reached a point after which things didn't work out and had to come up with new ideas. But I'm curious to see what you and other people think about this as an advice for the younger scholars in terms of selecting the topics.
So I'm not one to follow. I'm staying to do one topic. So
So that's the answer. You keep doing different
So
interesting things.
right. So work in some, perennial crops, tree crops. I mean, as a production economist, I span the area, so I mean, I may do precision dairy 1 month, and then I'm in agrivoltaic, and then I'm over here. So yes, I spread myself out in a lot of different areas, because I don't like to do one thing. Plus, it's also a diversity strategy, right?
Yeah.
Some of those go up and some of those go down,
Sure.
in terms of desire from a funding standpoint.
Anybody else? No?
Yeah, I have a question about the status of the project when apply for the granting. So if it for example, if I apply for a grant when it is just a proposal and I fail, and then I start to work with that project, and then I got some basic result and it become working paper, then I apply it again. Will it be considered?
Yeah, so to her point,
Not very-
we actually like that when a proposal comes back as a resubmission.
Mhm.
And they said, well, we decided not to wait. My university was willing to invest because I'm a young scholar and stuff. So we moved it ahead because that takes the risk off the funder. That takes what felt like a prospect and says, we as an institution took some of the risk of moving that down the road, and it's more likely we have some evidence to work now. So that to me is a very strong response to a resubmission, because it says, I didn't sit here stalled. I moved it as far as I could without resources. It's less risky to fund now because we did that. But then you probably want to add some either dimension or bigger sample or something, because if you're asking for the same amount of money, they say you did some of it. So I, at least when I've been on panels and saw someone do that, took it as a very strong signal. They were really committed to it and they weren't just hoping to get funded in that. They just took away some of the risk of funding it. I don't know if others have seen that ever.
Yeah.
I guess I would say that is a USDA philosophy and NIFA philosophy. NSF tends to be very risky and will take on things that are on the edge of being,
And I've only had a planning grant from NSF, so I'm not as well spoken in MSF.
NSF's a little bit of that.
So yeah, it was this an NSF you were thinking of? Okay.
More questions?
Have we completely overwhelmed everybody?
Keep trying.
Yeah.
Persistence.
Well, none of us, it sounds like we're super successful when we started. It's a hard thing to kind of keep swallowing when you get the first few rejections, but I would agree, whoever said it, it was night and day. As soon as I did my first panel, I went from 0% to 33% in 1 year. Seeing that many all at a time and how they were critiqued totally told me how I needed to be doing it differently. It was perfect.
And just to make the plug explicit, putting my RRDC hat on because I know NIFA asks us to plug this as much as possible. There are people running panels that are looking for panelists, and if you are a junior person, it's not a bad idea to go on them, including the fact that you often are compensated for sitting on a panel. I know there's
Minor
this-
compensation, but it's
Right,
fine.
I know there's at least one person in the room who's on the panel, others, and I know somebody yesterday said they were running a panel, Ariel. Said he was running a panel, so.
I think I've tricked everyone in this panel onto a panel at least once, didn't I?
Yeah.
So how do you, you mentioned, participating in those panels, how do you go about looking for those opportunities? Who do you ask, who do you approach?
Right, then that's the project.
Later.
We have a new one, Charlotte. Is it
There's a
Charlotte?
lot.
Yeah.
Well, most of us are gonna be in that social science. Her name
Yeah.
is Charlotte?
Charlotte Tuttle.
Yeah. Most of the programs we in the ag economists are related to will be Charlotte.
It's gonna be Charlotte, Sarah Rocker, and Ashley Mueller are gonna be your three. We don't have any key pairs.
And you just write them and say, I'm going to be on a panel. This is my name, just like all.
They'll love that.
Yeah. They
And
will.
NIFA now makes the NPLs very easy to find online
Hmm.
on the website. Like you can
Yeah.
actually go find who they are. It's weird. Who would have thought that would be important to
Yeah.
do?
But also these regional centers, if you have a regional SARE, a regional risk management education, regional rural development center, sometimes they have smaller grant programs that also have panels and advice reports. So it doesn't always have to be NIFA, but I learned the most being on the NIFA panels, I think.
Also, I think Hatch mid-level funds usually favor junior faculty, at least in Cornell, and it's a great way to start because it's USDA reporting and they are relatively easy to get because it depends on the university. So those are great too.
I'd like to hear some advice for tips, because whenever I write for any proposals, I find the time to be very limiting, because as a junior faculty, you have to publish, but then you also need to work on writing proposals. And so, for the summer last year, I worked on a proposal for NSF for maybe over a month and a half, like really dedicating time for the proposal. Then, but rejected, I felt that time has been wasted, and I could have spent the time for maybe publication and application. So, do you have any deeper advices for time management for posting on boards on publications?
I have a strong opinion on that. As an assistant professor, you want to play a minor role. You know, that somebody is the PI and then you do your part, because it takes time. It takes time. But the effort that you did, don't abandon it, because you get comments and you have that idea there. But as an assistant professor, I avoided being the main PI, trying to everything come from my, from my ideas, and I try to work with more senior people that were successful.
Or not the first 3 years, get that pipeline of articles started.
Yeah.
And that's, I didn't even try writing anything until I was 3 years in and had enough either accepted or in the pipeline that I thought would get accepted, that I knew I already kind of had tenure locked. And then but I got permission from my institution, that was okay. And we continue at CSU that grants are not a big criteria for the associate. At full, it's a very different story. And for most of us writing letters, we all out there writing letters for promotion packets, we would also say the same thing. We love to see some effort, but it should not be significant, particularly very, very early. You also have classes that you're originally prepping, and sometimes, I mean, the first 3 years is just killer. So that's even something for those of you who don't have job expectation out there, because it doesn't need to be a priority unless they have really high aspirations, or sometimes people have a career before they're bringing service from another school, then it's a different story. But if you're truly new and you also have your new preps, we actually tell people do the other stuff first, get that in play, and then start grants. But maybe other institutions don't feel that way. That's how we are, or be a minor player.
I think A&M does have an expectation for people to get grants, to be promoted to associate professor. But the strategy is similar. I mean, I don't think you want to lead one of those PI big grants. It takes a lot of time to do that. But one of the things when you do a research paper, it would be published eventually somewhere. You'll find a home. You just want it to be as high as possible. And so the grants do not necessarily have to be a zero-sum game. You already invested a lot of time to do that and find what's the core of that contribution. It's okay for you to modify, resubmit it to the NSF if you want to. Take a piece of that. One of the objectives is submit it to a smaller project that you might be able to do more feasible, that will result in some output. So don't let that be something that became a waste of time, that you just put it in your drawer and never use it again.
I would say find a senior faculty and rather.
Unless they already have 23 projects like Tyler.
Yeah, that's right.
I will take junior faculty and my postdocs.
Yeah.
And I will eat up the management of the grant if they can do the narratives. So that's a great way to start that process, to eliminate some of the management burden for you.
And look for people outside of your department too. It's okay to find people in other universities that you want to co-author with, collaborate with, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of somebody from outside of what you're looking at to get a better perspective.
Is this useful?
One other question. As a junior faculty member who's with a lot of grants, and I don't know about a lot, but grants that were not successful, is that something you would recommend putting on a CV, especially if you're talking to places that might be hiring? Do you put grants that you tried to get but were funded on a CV?
I don't. because I write about 40 grants a year. So that would be, and most of them are not funded. So it'd just be a lot of wasted space. But if you're a junior person, you have a few grants, you want to be able to show two things, that you're trying and that you're trying potentially as a PI. And it's not because you didn't care that you didn't submit anything. But I think that, you know, what's going to happen is eventually when you start getting all the grants, you're going to start deleting that section because it's not going to be relevant anymore. But when you're trying and you haven't hit your first success, I think it's good to showcase, hey, this person is really trying. And so I think that's important for the promotion process. Even if you get 1 or 2, but if you try 10, I mean, that showcases something.
Yeah.
I think I'm a loser. All my unfunded are still on my CV.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess maybe I started, I'm at the point too where I have to like now knock off 10 years back because it's getting long, but the only other thing I can say is that it signals beyond effort. That if people do come and look around at your CV and stuff and want to know if you actually have played in a space, because I'm like Tyler, I've done more topics than a normal person should do. And so it's also an indication of what I'm willing to work on if something comes along. But yeah, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer on that, except for if you feel like it needs to show an indication of intent. Pre-tenure, probably it makes a lot of sense. But I also think then these guys have been convinced now, like, be creative and at least try to take a sub-objective on one of those. And at bare minimum, almost every university has a seed grant program now, and just try to get some momentum built. I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah. At Cornell, we have to report successful and unsuccessful grants, and unsuccessful grants are very important when we are evaluating, you know, for reappointments and things like that, because that's exactly what they say. So I think it's a good idea to communicate with your chair to the department.
Yeah, at WSU, you have to justify your time, even if it was not successful. So yes, I spent my time writing this number of grants and they didn't get, but I have these ideas of how they can be successful the next time. So.
And if I can just personal that I've done is I was writing grants as a graduate student, as a doctoral student. And so it took 5 years to finally get the grant funded. But I get to show in my CV the progression that over the course of my doctoral studies, I kept working on revising the grant. And then, oh, look, right before I finished my PhD,
Persistent paid off.
$500,000.
That's great. I love it.
Right, I engaged in that process. And I've had really positive responses on the job.
So I think we're getting close to the end of the session. Do you have any last thoughts, any last questions? Shadi, any last thoughts?
Yeah,
Just a couple of comments. I agree with the fact that maybe as an assistant professor, you shouldn't prioritize being a PI, but I wouldn't discourage against it. If you want to try it, I think if it's successful, it sends a very strong signal of independence of thought. So some of these signals that they're looking at in your PNT through, being a first author of a paper, that similar signal could be sent through being a PI on a grant. So it's important not to put all of your eggs in one basket in that sense, but I wouldn't discourage against it.
When you have all our names, we're Googleable. So if you're struggling with something throughout the year and stuff, write us and we'll likely reply at 2 a.m. when we got the else. So I guess, yeah, this is definitely the one, it to me was one of the most intimidating parts of becoming a professor, to get through and actually get confidence. So, and again, I'll take back to the association the idea that maybe there is a space to actually have a place where if you have an intended place and bring a grant half developed and want to actually, because this is all vague today, but if like you actually start having some structure, we can give you far more directed advice like I would do for a junior faculty in my hallway. So that's a good way to use a mentoring workshop.
Yeah, because
it is becoming a big deal to come up with your own money for sure.
Yeah. Just want to mention also, there is a program, NSF, doctoral grants, dissertation grants that they are given to your graduate students, and they are not that hard to get. And they are great for graduate students and for you as faculty to, the length and the type of grant.
So you get credit for helping your grad student.
Exactly.
Actually, technically,
And
you're the
it's
PI
nice.
because I don't think they
Oh,
can
I've
be
never
the
done
PI.
that.
So,
They
yeah.
cannot be PIs, but they are actually, all the money goes to them to support their field work if they need to do. And they are, the rate of success is high in those programs. Look into that the dissertation grants for NSF, they are great, and it's a great experience for the graduate students.
I think it also signals quality because NSF, I mean, they're really hard to
Exactly.
get. And so it signals if you have papers that are not yet published or papers that are R&R, it sends a strong signal that
Mm.
reviewers have looked into your work and they think it's interest of science.
Yeah.
I think that we would be reminiscent if we didn't really thank Elizabeth Canales for organizing
Yes.
this wonderful
Yeah.
session. And thank you for participating.
On a Tuesday afternoon at the end of the
Yeah,
conference.
that's nice. It's a nice audience. No, thank you. Thank you,
Thank you
guys.
guys.
Learn a lot from
I have to
everything.
be on a
you
panel
do.
with you guys actually. so it's awesome.
Yeah. Bye, Shadi.
Hi, Shadi.
We
Thank
forgot
you.
about
Bye, everyone.
for 30
This
minutes.
virtual thing is just not-
Yeah, thanks for the Zoom option.